All 224 passengers on board a Russian airliner which crashed on its way back from an Egyptian holiday resort are confirmed dead. Relatives of the passengers are mourning their loved ones in St Petersburg, where the plane had been heading. The plane is said to have suddenly dropped 1.5 kilometres before disappearing from radars. We spoke to several aviation experts about what could have caused such a rapid descent. You're watching RT International with me, Daniel Hawkins. Just turned 5 p.m. in Moscow, the Russian capital. Welcome to the program. Our breaking news dominating this hour: a Russian passenger plane carrying more than 200 passengers and crew, the vast majority of them Russian, has crashed in Egypt. There were no survivors, according to the country's officials. The plane was en route from the resort city of Sharm el-Sheikh to St Petersburg, but went down in the Sinai Peninsula just a little over 20 minutes after takeoff. Emergency teams were soon at the crash site, working through the debris of the plane. Well, the news that everyone had been killed shattered the last hopes of relatives who'd gathered at the international airport in St Petersburg. For several hours, they had been waiting for information about their loved ones, with mixed reports coming from different sources. Now, 6 medical crews, including 20 psychologists, have been sent to help people suffering from shock. Tomorrow has been declared a national day of mourning here in Russia. The catastrophe is the deadliest in Russia's aviation history. Well, back with us now in the studio is Madina Kochinova, RT correspondent, who's been following the story throughout the day. Madina, what can you tell us latest information about the victims of this crash? What do we know so far?
Well, we know, and that information was confirmed, that overall there were 224 people on board. Now, it's also confirmed that 2 passengers were Ukrainian, there was 1 Belarusian, and all the others were of Russian citizens. We also know that the number of children has increased. It is now confirmed that 24 children were on board of the doomed plane. Now, Daniel, over the coming days, we're likely to hear many tragic stories of families who have been enjoying their seaside holidays at the Sharm el-Sheikh resort. And in fact, these kind of stories have already started emerging. Now, take this example, for instance, of a photo that was posted on social media, on Russian social media, Vkontakte, of a man holding a child as there are about to board this doomed flight. Now, the picture that I'm talking about was posted by a woman whose name and date of birth matches with the passenger's manifest that was released earlier today by the air company. Now, she posted a picture accompanied by these words: "Goodbye Egypt" and "Hello St Petersburg." Tragic stories, and we are likely to hear many more of these tragic stories to come in the next couple of days.
Absolutely, it's going to be a difficult period, I'm sure. Of course, the numbers involved, over 200 people, the worst such disaster in Russia's aviation history, is bad enough in itself. But as the details are coming through, adding faces to these victims is truly heartbreaking. Of course, the research operation is still ongoing at the scene there. We've heard reports several hours ago about voices being heard from the debris. That's looking unlikely now. What's the latest on the search operation on the ground in Sinai?
Well, it was confirmed by both Russian and Egyptian authorities that no one survived on board of the plane. And overall, already over 150 bodies have been pulled out of the wreckage at the crash scene. And we do know that the wreckage of the plane split into 2. Now, 17 bodies of children have been found. We do know that the bodies have already been sent to Cairo for further examination. Now, in terms of the victims of the relatives of the victims back here in Russia, in St Petersburg. Now, they have already been asked by the investigative team to give out their DNA samples to help identify the victims of the crash. But so far, as I said, confirmed information, 150 bodies have already been retrieved.
So a rising body count there, tragically, at the scene of that crash. Medina, thanks so much for bringing us up to the latest. We'll be with you again, no doubt, next hour. Medina Korchinova, that was RT correspondent there, bringing us up to the latest. Well, the plane suddenly dropped 1.5 kilometres before disappearing from radars. The website Flight Radar shows this change in altitude moments before the plane came down. Egyptian authorities are now saying the plane crashed almost vertically. Earlier, we asked former Vice President of the Australian International Pilots Association, Captain Richard Woodward, about this detail.
If indeed the engines had failed, or one engine had failed, then the rate of descent would be quite minor. As the crew maintained power on the one remaining engine, it would have come down at only about 200 metres a minute. If both engines had failed, that would give you a dramatic loss of speed initially, but the crew would have had to lower the nose and commence what's called a glide descent. Even if they did that, it still would not come down at 1,500 metres a minute. It would come down much less than that. If indeed the aircraft had a double engine failure, it would glide for 20-25 minutes before it crashed, and it would not break up in flight. The commentary earlier said that eyewitnesses reported the aircraft was on fire before it crashed. That is often the case. 65% of all eyewitnesses report aircraft are on fire before they crash, when in fact they weren't.
Well, RT correspondents attempting to get to the scene of the crash have so far been denied access by the Egyptian Defence Ministry. We're keeping across the story from our headquarters here in Moscow. In September, Egypt's government forces started a major offensive against an ISIL affiliate on the Sinai Peninsula, where the plane came down. The group has claimed responsibility for a number of deadly attacks against security forces and even reportedly managed to destroy a Navy vessel with a rocket launcher. Egyptian officials, however, have rejected the possibility that the Russian passenger plane was shot down. Russia's transport minister confirmed there are no special flight restrictions in place in the region. Well, we are going to go now live to Cairo to speak to freelance journalist Alessandra Bajic, who's there right now. Alessandra, thanks so much for joining us again for the latest information. What stage are the rescue operations at this moment in time, or rather, at this point, the recovery operation?
Okay, yes, planes of Egyptian armed forces actually detected the wreckage area in the actual Al Hassan area itself, which is a mountainous site located near the city of El Arish in North Sinai. Up to 45 to 50 ambulances were actually dispatched to the site where the plane crash took place, and in order to carry the victims to hospitals in Suez as well as in Cairo. That's in coordination with the armed forces, and also other rescue operations were conducted to carry the victims from the site of the crash to Al-Mazar airport and other airports nearby Cairo. And for there, that's being conducted by air operations, and from there, wounded will be carried to Nasser Institute and Dar el-Shifa hospitals. That's for the wounded, but for the bodies of the dead, they're expected to be carried to Zenhom morgue. And in actual fact, we received some information just earlier, about an hour ago, that they're expected to be brought to Zenhom morgue anytime soon. So that's really what's happened in terms of delivering search and rescue operations today.
It's likely, of course, that will go on well into the evening, and indeed the ongoing investigation will continue with the finding of those black boxes, which will, of course, be key to establishing what happened to this plane. In terms of the location where this plane came down and where the operation is ongoing, what sort of obstacles will the recovery teams face? We understand that the terrain is not hospitable and indeed the region is volatile. Could this perhaps have an impact on that operation?
Well, indeed, the region has been volatile for some time now. Militancy has been on the rise inside Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, particularly following the military ouster of President Morsi in July 2013, and more protests that followed after that. Now, it needs to be said that attacks have regularly taken place against security and military targets. However, really, I mean, as we see that this has been another case of civilian losses and wounded in Egypt following last month's also death of Mexican tourists. That is I believe, causing quite a concern, particularly, if we think of the impact that will make on the tourism industry. I mean, again, last month, a group of Mexican tourists were killed mistakenly by Egyptian security forces in the western desert area, believing that they were terrorists. So, yeah, that's definitely adding up, more concern at the moment.
Absolutely, yeah. So a difficult operation indeed to conduct for those search and rescue teams and the investigators when they arrive on the site to establish what exactly has happened. Alessandra Bajic, based in Cairo, thank you so much for joining us and bringing us the latest news from that site. Well, here is a recap of the details of this tragedy. Flight 9268 departed from the Egyptian resort of Sharm el-Sheikh at 3:51 a.m. GMT. It's reported that it started losing speed and altitude at a rate of 30 meters per second. That was shortly before the plane disappeared completely from radars. The event occurred just 23 minutes after takeoff at 4:14 GMT. The crew had been due to make contact with air traffic controllers, but failed to do so. Senior lecturer in aviation studies at Kingston University, Dr. Anil Padra, says the circumstances around the crash are rather unusual.
The aircraft climbed fairly well. It climbed as you would normally expect the aircraft to climb. Around about 23 minutes into the flight, the aircraft achieved something like 31,000 feet. And then all of a sudden, it dropped altitude rather quickly, and it's unclear why that was. And I think, it could be a number of reasons. Nothing at this stage can be ruled out. But if the pilot did report mechanical failure, then that is probably a very good explanation. It is fairly rare, though, for an aircraft to get to cruise altitude and then have an issue. Normally, if it's got some sort of mechanical problems, it will be during the climb phase when the aircraft and its engines are under the most amount of stress. It's possible that the aircraft may not have been maintained correctly, or we just don't know. But on the aircraft itself, fairly safe.
We've got a number of eyewitnesses' accounts coming in now. Some are claiming they saw one of the plane's engines catch fire. Other reports suggest that the plane broke up in mid-air. Now, Egypt's aviation ministry claims the black box flight recorders have been found. Airbus pilot Marin Medic told us the plane should have been thoroughly checked before the flight.
The Airbus family is very reliable and have an extremely low rate of incidents or accidents that are caused by technical problems. If the crew indeed expressed concerns about engine problems earlier this week, then certainly those problems would have been resolved before any flight, not just this flight, but the first subsequent flight. Because no mechanic will release faulty aircraft into service, and no crew, as a final check, will actually take off with a faulty aircraft. I mean, it's even if you forget the passengers and the cabin crew, it's, if nothing else, it's about their own lives. So I'm quite convinced that whatever concerns they had were resolved prior to this flight.
Well, RT will be bringing you all the latest details on that tragedy as soon as we get them.
Do we speak your language? Want news, programs and documentaries in Arabic? It's all here on RT. Reporting from the world's hotspots, VIP interviews, intriguing stories. Are you here? Then try RT Arabic. To find out more, visit arabic.rt.com.
On October 30th, in Moscow, will open an enormous museum of the history of the Gulag. In the United States, there is no national state museum of the history of slavery. So we are still, I would not be prepared to say that we have moved towards social justice and understanding faster than Russia has. This would be the best competition. Instead of building nuclear weapons, we should have a competition. Which country can achieve historical justice more quickly?
US authorities have been deflecting accusations of a major policy change in Syria. That's after the announcement that Washington will deploy special forces troops in the country. It was a tough day in the job for officials.
There was no prohibition that I'm aware of any boots on the ground in Syria.
I've just been watching video clips of the president in a news conference saying, I will not put boots on the ground in Syria.
I will not put American boots on the ground in Syria. It is not the authorization of another ground war.
I don't know how much more clear you can be about stating a policy or a position.
Let's just say, for argument's sake, that you're right. I haven't seen every quote that was issued about this. My point to you would be, so what? So what?
It's just that I don't understand the administration's reluctance to acknowledge when something has changed.
Mission creep occurs when the mission changes.
Previous policy did not encompass putting boots on the ground in Syria. Wait a minute. Your current strategy, as outlined by the White House, does include putting boots on the ground in Syria.
I love the gotcha aspect here. Well, you know, you said this and now you're doing that. That's what you do if you want to win.
Well, the administration maintains it will not send more than 50 commandos to the country. That number is actually more likely to be around 30. They will be used for an advise and assist mission. The troops will coordinate coalition anti-ISIL airstrikes and work together with so-called moderate Syrian opposition, as well as Kurdish fighters. But as RT's Gayen Chikayan reports, the announcement sparked major concerns.
The U.S. is planning to send up to 50 special operations forces to Syria to serve as military advisors in the fight against ISIL. U.S. officials say they will be advising moderate rebels in Syria. The question that comes to mind is what moderate rebels exactly? The Pentagon has recently scrapped its training program there because it could not find enough moderate rebels to train.
I wasn't satisfied with the early efforts in that regard, and so we're looking at different ways to achieve basically the same kind of strategic objective.
The White House has gone only as far as to say this.
The role that they will have is to offer training, to offer advice, and to offer some assistance to local opposition fighters on the ground in Syria.
It's another sign of the U.S. trying to do something without any definition of what the end game is and what we hope to accomplish, and certainly without coordination with people in the government.
A U.S. soldier died in a hostage rescue mission in Iraq last week. The White House maintains that it was an operation led by the Kurds in Iraq and U.S. soldiers were, quote-unquote, in vicinity. Well, this sounds like lawyering to many. But regardless of their mission, the presence of American troops in Iraq is different from their going to Syria. Because to Syria, they're going without an invitation of the government there.
We said that we were going in. We're not telling the Syrian government what we're going to be doing or where we're going. We're just going to go ahead and do it. And again, that's without either permission from the Assad government or clearly a UN mandate to do so.
This could potentially put them in direct confrontation with the Syrian army. It is also not clear whether there's going to be enough coordination between all anti-ISIL forces on the ground and in the air in Syria to prevent a clash. In Washington, I'm Ganesh Chekyan, RT.
Well, it seems all countries agree that the main goal in Syria is eradicating Islamic State. The starting point could be stripping the terrorists of their main source of income, which is oil. RT's Daniel Bushell explains more.
ISIL's branded the world's richest terror force for good reason. Smuggling looted antiquities and taking Westerners hostage bring profits. But the top earners by far are from raiding banks and netting petrodollars. In a new report, the US Treasury admits Islamic State will earn a massive $500 million this year alone from selling oil. In June, ISIL seized Iraq's largest oil refinery in Beji, some 200 kilometres from the capital, Baghdad. Beji produces a third of all the country's oil. Terrorists have reportedly booby-trapped trenches, sand barracks and roadside bombs to stop government forces striking back. The group's estimated to hold 6 oil fields in Iraq and another 9 in Syria, producing 50,000 barrels a day. ISIL's tried to seize another 11 crude deposits in war-torn Libya. With no central government in that country, it's even hard to verify if they succeeded. The US keeps threatening to cut ISIL's access to oil and money markets. State Department even admits we have tools at hand to stop them. But in practice, terror analyst Christian Duhame notes the American coalition hasn't even blocked those earnings, despite over a year of fighting. So why is the US seemingly so impotent when it confirms it has, quote, tools to paralyze their operations?
We really have not had a cohesive policy toward dealing with ISIL. It's been an impromptu policy, a policy that's been patched together. Well, maybe we'll try to cooperate with the Saudis. Maybe we'll try to train a free Syrian army. None of this has worked, and there's not been an overarching theme behind this policy.
Now, Russia's hitting ISIL's supply routes, but it's hard when even supposed partners in the fight against terror are, shall we say, less than resolute. This former CIA officer has revealed the oil's also being bought across the border by NATO state Turkey. The question is why the US and allies aren't making more effort to stop terrorist trade in the black gold.
We're going to bring you back to our breaking news now for this hour. A Russian passenger plane carrying more than 200 passengers and crew, the vast majority of them Russian, has crashed in Egypt. There were no survivors, that's according to the country's officials. Well, the plane was en route from the resort city of Sharm el-Sheikh going to St Petersburg in Russia, but went down in the Sinai Peninsula just little over 20 minutes after taking off. Emergency teams were soon at the crash site, working through the debris of the plane. Well, the news that everyone had been killed shattered the last hopes of relatives who gathered at the international airport in St Petersburg. For several hours, they had been waiting for information about their loved ones, with mixed reports coming from various sources. Now, 6 medical crews, including 20 psychologists, have been sent to help people suffering from shock. Well, tomorrow has been declared a national day of mourning in the country. The catastrophe is the deadliest in Russia's aviation history. Well, back to the studio now, where I'm joined by Medina Gorchinova. Medina, we understand you've got some more updates about what exactly is the reason behind this tragic event.
Well, of course, the investigative crew on the ground and at the scene of the crashes are looking into possible reasons behind this particular crash, and of course, the investigators are examining whether the plane had any technical problems during the flight or even prior to the flight, as there were reports that the pilot requested an emergency landing during the flight, that the crew members and the pilot requested rerouting, and there were reports that the plane was about to land to perform an emergency landing at the Cairo airport, and that the plane crashed some 100 kilometers short of the airport where the pilot hoped to make an emergency landing. However, we do have more information concerning the plane itself. Now, that's according to Russia's transportation ministry, that that particular plane had a valid flying license and was classed as flight worthy, and that the aircraft was only 18.5 years old, which is a decent age for any passenger plane, and it is an okay age. There is nothing particular about that fact, and that was previously operated by a number of airliners, by Lebanese, Turkish, Saudi and Syrian airliners, and at the moment of the crash was operated by a Russian airliner, Kagilim Avia, which is located in western Siberia. And we have a statement coming from the airliner claiming that there are actually no grounds to blame the human error, saying that the pilot had over 12,000 flight hours. And at the moment, the operations of the airliner are under review of the investigators. So it is really early to determine the actual reason, but of course the investigation is underway.
Absolutely. I'm sure we'll get more pieces of information as that investigation progresses throughout today and the following days. Medina, thanks so much for bringing us up to date on that again. Well, we'll bring you more on the crash at the top of this hour. Do stay with us.